What incredible things happen when you stop settling for a life that looks good on paper and start choosing one that feels alive with the dreams and desires you haven't claimed yet. It's your host, Katie Kay, artist, mentor, entrepreneur, founder of the Creator Code, and mentor for women ready for the best chapter of their life. Are you ready for more? Fuck yes. Let's go, my loves. Well, hello there. I have been in a really deep funk these last couple of weeks, and so I took some time out from recording because I only ever want to record these transmissions, these stories, when I'm coming from a really good place inside myself, where I feel clarity and where I can stream my thoughts and feelings and beliefs and experiences from a place that feels aligned with who I am and where I'm going. The last couple of weeks have felt like I was moving through a really deep fog, and I found it hard to actually think clearly during that time. When I woke up this morning, I could feel that the energy had changed, had shifted. Welcome to the first day of this astrological year. I'm really excited to be in the energy of the beginning. This last month of Mercury retrograde and all kinds of other planetary transitions has felt really wobbly and confusing, and I know it's been like that for a lot of people. I can actually feel the remnants of it in my voice, in my throat, which is my place to transmit, and it's why this podcast feels so aligned and so juicy and so rich to me, because when I speak, the truth comes out. I actually can't help it, and I don't always know what's going to come out of my mouth when I open it, and I'm embracing that and going with it. This week, I'm really excited to share with you some stories from my life and to talk about how easy it is to lose your way when you don't have the right radar switched on. What I realized as I was contemplating my life over the last few weeks is that I've been raised with a radar, a special radar that we don't all have because we weren't all blessed with a very particular type of upbringing that I was, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm going to share some of that with you. I have this inbuilt radar for aliveness and truth and authenticity. And I'm going to talk about why I have that and what's happened and what happens when you don't have that radar, and how easy it is to lose your way. I've lost my way many times by ignoring that radar, by overriding it, and by listening to other voices and other messages and conditioning outside of my own body. My childhood was unique because I was born into a family of artists. And I think this is quite a rare thing. I've never met anybody who had a childhood quite like mine. I've met a few people who had similarities, and it does feel like a kind of beautiful affinity when I come across that. There's a type of weirdness growing up surrounded by art, books, paintings, drawings, artists, that is really unlike any other upbringing. And to add to that, I'm also first generation Australian. My parents were both migrants, and they came to Australia in the mid-century with their families. They came from different countries with different history, different experiences, different reasons for coming here. But that's also a really deep part of my upbringing too. So I had double weirdness going on. Weird arty girl from an art family, and also just weird girl who came from a family that wasn't typically Australian. We didn't eat the same food. We didn't dress the same way. We didn't wrap our sandwiches in the same way. My sandwiches were wrapped in greaseproof paper. Everyone else's sandwiches were wrapped in Glad wrap. And that immediately makes you stand out as a child. All our clothes were homemade, or they came from op shops, which is what we used to call them before the word thrift came in. And that was different to everybody else too. And it was hard to convince my parents that I needed to have the things that everybody else had, because that just wasn't their MO in life. They didn't want to be like everybody else. They were living their own life, their own way. And so my life was surrounded by beauty and self-expression and art, seeing it, speaking about it, experiencing it. I was the most happy when I was creating, drawing, listening to music, dancing, playing with my imaginary friends, being outside in nature. I had a really solid relationship with the fairies in my garden. My favourite ever birthday present was a set of 72 Derwent colouring pencils. They came in like a double-tiered tin. I still have them. Some of them are that long. I think I got them for my birthday maybe when I was around 9 or 10. My parents used to keep all of my best drawings, cut them out of whatever they were drawn in, and stick them into this huge book. It was like yay big, and I'm sure they still have it. And they would stick them in and put the dates on the bottom as a record of my artistic journey, like a visual arts diary that you might have at school, except this was my real life and my parents kept that for me. We never had a family holiday. We didn't have disposable income. We didn't really watch TV. And our family activities were mostly visits to my parents' friends' houses and their studios. And most of my parents' friends were artists. And I would sit in these eclectic houses that were somewhat similar to my house. And I would read or draw, sometimes watch a movie, or sometimes listen to adult conversation. And they always talked about deep things, art, philosophy, no small talk. And I got used to this. I got used to this environment of constantly being around creators and creation and this particular type of energy, which is following that life force that lives inside of every single one of us. It never had to be encouraged. It was just part of who we were. It was part of who I was. It was just me. And I never really had to think about it. And so at some point, I guess it seemed obvious that I would follow that path and that I would make my life into art. And so I did. And from a very young age, I wanted to be an actor. My very first stage experience was at age 6 in a school musical. I think I was in kindergarten or year 1. And I got to be in a chorus on stage, and I'll never forget that feeling. I still actually remember it, and I don't have a lot of memories under the age of about 7 or 8, but I do have this one. And then I also remember either the year after or the year or the same year getting to play a fairy in another school play, and I got to wear a little fairy dress and dance to one of the songs in the Nutcracker Suite. I remember those experiences very vividly, and it really activated something in me. And although I loved all forms of art, performance was the one that attracted me the most. And I actually followed that dream right through to the age of around 19 when I changed my mind. This childhood that I had and this compulsion, this necessity to follow my heart and to continuously engage in my self-expression led me to always leaning into that, to always listening and to always following my creative flow and my heart, and to really noticing as I got older and went into adulthood what happened when I didn't. And I've learnt some really interesting lessons from that and that I'm going to share with you on this episode. I grew an aliveness radar. A radar that noticed when I wasn't being my authentic self, when I wasn't trusting my heart, when I wasn't listening to the inner voices that just knew what I needed to do and how I needed to be, when I wasn't following my truth. I developed an intolerance for inauthenticity and for anything that isn't heart-led, that isn't my truth, that doesn't feed me on a soul level. Every single time that I've not paid attention to this, or that I've forgotten my creative flow, my aliveness, my self-expression, things have gone horribly wrong. Now you're probably thinking that if I grew up with parents like my parents, both artists, that I would have been encouraged to follow whatever creative, crazy dream I might have. But actually, that's not what happened. Because the thing is that even though we can have these radars and they can be attached very powerfully to who we are and what we believe, to our values, to how we want to be in the world, to everything that we care about. That doesn't mean that we're not conditioned by society. That doesn't mean that we're not under the influence of other people's thoughts and opinions and values. And my parents are in the baby boomer generation, and they both believed that stability was really important, that it was really important to go out and get a job that paid the bills. And my parents, although they were both artists, my dad still worked a job. He worked in the art world. Like, luckily for him, he got to be around the thing that he loved. But it was a job. It was a 9-to-5 job, 5 days a week. He had to be part of the rat race, part of the system, part of the matrix. And it didn't always make him happy. But that's what he felt he needed to do to put a roof over our heads, to make sure we were safe and to provide for us, to provide for his family. And so as I got older and I started to express what I wanted to do with my life, which was go to Hollywood and be an actress, I wasn't encouraged. In fact, I was actively discouraged. And so my very first experience of the dissonance between my own internal life force, my own soul and my heart and what it wanted, and the outside world, was when my parents said that they didn't think it was a good idea for me to go to acting school. That they wanted me to have not just a backup plan, but an actual plan that came first to make sure that I was going to be okay, that I was going to be able to support myself, that I was going to be able to live and be safe in the world. And because of how I'd been brought up, because of this internal radar that I was growing and developing and building, it felt horrible to me to be told that I couldn't go and live out my dreams, or that they should take a back seat for security and stability, because that wasn't what I had learnt to pay attention to this whole entire time. I was 17. I was just a little younger than many high school graduates at the end of year 12, and I could have gone and done anything. I had extremely high academic results, and I really could have studied anything I wanted at any university that I wanted to go to, maybe with a few exceptions, but pretty much. But I had absolutely no desire to do that. I wanted to get into NIDA, which is Australia's most well-known dramatic arts school. That was all I cared about. And I knew that it was a very slim chance that I'd be able to do that at the age of 17, straight after coming out of high school, because they mostly want you to have a little bit of life experience and a little bit of maturity. And so I did audition, and I was told to come back next year. And part of my process was that I wanted to take a year off, a gap year, and I wanted to get into acting school. And if I didn't get into that one, I would get into one of the other 2 or 3 that were available to me. And so I made a deal with my parents that if I didn't get into acting school, I would do what they suggested. And what they suggested was that I go to a university not far from where we lived and study journalism. I can't tell you how little I wanted to do that. It was the most boring idea I think I could have possibly thought of. Maybe with the exception of if they'd said to be an accountant. But I know my parents would never have suggested that, because the numbers are just not their thing. But they had seen that I had a gift for writing, that I had a strong sense of justice, that I cared about the world. And so the most sensible idea that they could come up with was that I become a journalist. And I'm pretty sure that if I had followed that path, I would have been a great journalist. Because one of the things that you often grow up with as a Gen Xer to boomer parents, especially when you're the firstborn, a high-achieving female, which I always have been, you learn to get really good at whatever you're given. And so I know that if I'd followed that path, I would have been good at it. But I also knew at age 17 that that was absolutely not the path for me. That I absolutely had to follow this deep passion inside of me to be on stage, to be in film, to express myself, to be an artist. That's all I wanted. And that felt like the most alive thing in me at that point in my life. And so I made a deal with my parents because I knew that I was going to get into acting school. It didn't happen that year. I took a year off. I moved out of home. I did plays. I did theatre. I did music. And I got into acting school the following year. And that was the first experience that I had of the difference between your aliveness, your truth, your authenticity, and the world's idea of what we should do. In this particular case, it was my parents' idea, but it wasn't their authentic truth either. It was what they'd learnt and how they were brought up and what they'd experienced. And it seemed like a good plan. It looked good on paper. It made sense. It was logical. It was safe. But it wasn't coming from here. It wasn't coming from here. It wasn't coming from me, from my aliveness, from my creative life force. The second story I want to share is a little later in my life, in my 20s, when I lost myself in a really toxic relationship. It was abusive in a few different ways. And I really lost myself. I lost the sense of who I was. I forgot how to stand up for myself. I forgot how to speak my truth because I was so worried about being judged. I was worried about what would happen if I said what I really thought. I became so attached to this person that I was scared that if I didn't have them, that I wouldn't be able to go on, that my life would feel worthless. And you might be wondering, how does a young woman who is so attached to her aliveness and her creativity and her life force and her truth become so lost? And it's honestly, the answer is the same as it would be for any human, because we are vulnerable and we are subject to hurt and wounds, and none of us are free of the deep pain of being human and our attachments to other people and how they can go wrong and not necessarily pan out the way we expect. I hold absolutely no resentment or ill feelings towards this human that I was in a relationship with whatsoever, because I know that we all act from our experiences, our lived experiences, the way we were raised, from the things that we need, the things we're lacking. And in this particular case, I was so desperate to have a fulfilling relationship, so desperate to feel wanted and loved, that I was willing to put my own needs aside. And so over the course of this relationship, I lost my voice, I lost friendships, I lost attachments to other things in the world. I made myself feel better in all kinds of ways that were destructive to me. Too much alcohol, smoking weed, doing anything I possibly could to numb the really negative feelings that I was having. I wasn't well mentally during this time. That happens to any human caught in a toxic relationship, because you start to see things differently to the truth. And so during this period of time, I really forgot who I was. And I still kept some of my practices. I wrote a lot during this time. I kept a journal and I wrote a lot of things. I maintained my creativity through my work and my study as well. So I wasn't completely lost, but I'd forgotten who I was at the core of my being. And I certainly wasn't the same person that I was at age 17 or 18 or 19 or 20 or 21. And this went on for quite some time. And when I eventually broke free of this relationship and re-established my life afterwards and went through a really deep, long healing journey. And look, to be honest, I didn't really know what I was doing and I didn't really seek the correct help at this point in time. I was really young and I didn't really know that much about the body, the brain, trauma, memory. I certainly hadn't heard of parts work. And my experience of psychology at that time was really limited to CBT and talk therapy, and it wasn't really that helpful. And so I went into another phase of life at this point, which was about me re-establishing all of the other parts of my life to provide safety and to find myself again. I was so far from the person that I used to be that I didn't really know how to rebuild it. And so what I did was I ended up moving into a career, a new career, and I ended up putting all of my energy and attention into this career. And within this career, I also lost myself in a different way. I was trying to patch up the hurt and throw myself into something new that wasn't all about a relationship, that wasn't so emotionally consuming. And in doing so, I accidentally became completely absorbed in another unaligned path, but I didn't know it at the time. I threw myself into a traditional work experience, a traditional job, a 9-to-5 job. It was a very satisfying job. It was a job that allowed me to grow and learn. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. And I threw myself wholeheartedly into it. It was challenging at times. I went through some really big challenges, first with a particular boss, then with the work itself. I was promoted a few times. I did a really good job. I was happy. I remember when I took the job, telling my dad that I had a public service job. It was permanent. It was secure. I was in the public service. And in the city that I live in, that's a pretty big achievement. That means security, stability, solid income, a future, lots of opportunity for promotion if you're a hard worker. It felt good. I knew I could start a family and get maternity leave. I knew that my wage would go up each year. There were no red flags. There wasn't anything to worry about. And I remember calling my dad and telling him, I've got a job in the public service. And I remember this pause. And then he sort of laughed in a weird way. And I was like, why are you laughing? And he said, it just doesn't seem like you. And I remember being really irritated by this comment, by what it meant, and thinking, isn't this what you always wanted for me? Stability, security, logic, being sensible, after such a long time of not being sensible. And he said, it's fine, it's good, I'm happy for you. I'm just surprised. And it's funny how I've never forgotten that comment. I stayed in this job for 7 years, and like I said, I got promoted. It became different types of jobs over the years, and it was always changing. But in the end, I realised that I'd lost myself inside of it. I remember having a conversation with a boss who really helped me develop certain skills and was really encouraging of me. And he brought me into his office one day, and we were the same age. And he said, Katie, I think you have a lot of potential. I think you could make it in this career. I think you could go on and pick up an EL1 level position and then pick up an EL2, which is where he was. And I think you could do really great. I think you could go even further if you wanted to. But you're too emotional and you need to work on that. And a part of me listened very intently because he was my boss and he knew me really well and he'd been really good to me. And that meant helping me, supporting me, encouraging me in lots of different ways to get better at what I was doing. But there was just something about what he said that triggered something in me, something really deep, a rebellious streak, a knowing. It was my radar of aliveness pinging, saying, danger, 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 do not listen to this man. He was a good man and he wanted the best for me. But the best that he was imagining was not the best that I was imagining. And so I knew in that instant that there was absolutely no way that I was going to stay in the public service and that I was going to become an EL1 or an EL2 or any other higher level. And that my too emotional was my self-expression. It was my passion. It was my aliveness. And that at no point had it ever been inappropriate. It just wasn't fitting into the extremely polished, extremely well-behaved, extremely boring persona that I needed to take on in order to succeed in that space. And so it probably wouldn't surprise you to know that that was really the end of that career choice. And at this point in time, I was beginning to build my business, my first proper business, my first business that actually earned me a living wage. And that was how I found myself again and realised that all of the things that maybe didn't fit into the corporate world, the public service world, the polished, well-behaved world, all of the things that didn't fit were actually the things that were going to bring me my greatest success. And one more story that I want to share is that as I grew my business and as I realized what it took to go from 5 figures to 6 figures and then started the climb to 7 figures, that there were certain things that I had to do and be inside my business that actually brought up this conditioning again, that I began to prioritize productivity and the external idea of success, which wasn't my internal radar of aliveness. And so I began to lose myself inside my business. And I began to become burnt out. I began to experience that. I began to question why I was doing certain things. I began to get lost inside of schedules and to-do lists and certain achievements, numbers, booking levels, how I was going to get to 7 figures, scaling, growing, building a team. And I'm not saying any of those things aren't important. Of course they are, as long as they align with your aliveness, with your creative life force, with your authenticity, with who you are as a human, with what you want, with your purpose. Because we can so easily get off track because that radar, that's not out in the world. That doesn't exist in the world. What exists in the world right now is a system that we're all beholden to. And it takes courage and guts, and it takes a really strong radar to come away, to step off that train and to do it your way. And you have to keep realigning because it's very easy to get caught up. And at different chapters in your life, you can become unbalanced. You can listen too hard to a piece of advice or be influenced by a specific thing that happens, as you move through different chapters of your life, especially when it comes to parenting, to schooling, to income levels, to mortgages, to all of those hard things that we take on as we get older, as we start to adult better. But my aliveness radar is really strong. I can see it in myself, the aliveness, the truth, the authenticity. My ability to see this in others is really finely tuned. In fact, sometimes it's probably better when I see it in others. It's probably more finely tuned even than within myself. As I contemplated my shares for this week's episode, I had a lot of questions, a lot of internal questions about whether or not I really am the best person to teach and advise and see where others aren't following their aliveness, because it's so natural to me, because of this radar that I have that I grew at a very young age. And I'm very aware that not everybody has this as powerfully tuned in as I do. But I came to a really solid conclusion, and that is that because of the fact that you can't just follow this perfectly all the time, because of the fact that I have gone off track so many times, and I've shared 3 or 4 of those stories with you in this episode, I think I am a really great teacher for this, because I know how easy it is to not listen. I know how easy it is to override it. I know how easy it is to get off track. And I know how easy it also is to tune back in to this part of you, this authentic part of you that knows, that sees, that feels, and how the shift can go from over here to back here. And it's subtle. And there are nuances and shades of grey everywhere. And that's wonderful, because we don't want life to be boring. And when I share my light, when I share my joy in my life right now, it's not without challenges, because life is always this incredible tapestry of ups and downs and twists and turns. It's never just one thing. It would be so boring if it was. And so even though now I am so tuned into this radar, and I've built other radars too, which have also been incredible, and I'll share more about, I'm also experiencing grief and hardship and deep challenges on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, just like everybody else. But I'm really aligned with my purpose, and I'm really aligned with my aliveness, and I'm really aligned with this desire to live a beautiful, rich, fulfilling life. And so I can see the subtle differences, the subtle shifts that we can make to be more aligned, to be more in our truth, and what happens when we do that, how we grow, how we become more courageous, more confident, more beautiful. And I just I want nothing more than to live that life, to keep living that life, and to inspire others to, and to show you, to hold you through the shifts as you tune your aliveness radar. And so my question this week is, let's use our hindsight, because our hindsight is so sharp. It's so finely tuned to truth. I want you to think back on your life. Think back on a time or times when you were the most lost, or the most dull, or the most stuck. And can you identify what caused that and how it manifested into your choices and into your life, and how your life played out at that point? And just really think about that, really contemplate that, because that probably was a deviation from your true path, from following your aliveness and your creative life force and your truth and your authenticity and who you really are. And then maybe you can apply that same filter to your current life and see some places where you might be able to shift, where you might currently be doing this. They might not be big, they might be quite subtle, and see if maybe you can make some small changes. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear what dropped in, what resonated, if you had any aha moments, what you noticed, and the answer to this question if you contemplate it. If something in this episode stirred you, resonated, made you feel epiphany, if you've been sensing a pattern in your life and can't quite name it, if you're really sick of constantly reinventing yourself, constantly thinking that you need to do better, fix yourself, and you want some clarity, I'd love to invite you into my free Creator Code class. It's a 45 to 50 minute class. It will answer some of the questions that might have come up while you listen to this episode. It will answer some of the questions that you might have been having about your own life recently. And it will orient you through your own lived experience, not mine. And it also includes the best somatic practice that I've ever had the privilege of learning and teaching, which is kindred meditation, that has deeply impacted and changed my life and the way I relate to my body and its infinite wisdom. And it introduces the Creator Code, which is the body of work that means everything to me, that I am deeply engaged in right now. And I have so many juicy things coming up that I can't wait to share with you about that. And that's it for episode 6.